Chapter 8, The Moral Politician. How to Pass a Mandatory Vaccination Law in Your State. It was the beginning of a new legislative cycle, and Tom Landon wasn't looking forward to all the long nights and weekends ahead. His boss, Senator Charlene Emerson, Democrat, was on a mission again, a mission that had failed here in their state last year. And she wanted to take another bipartisan stab at it this year, again with Senator James Corson, Republican. Tom hated bipartisan bills. Republicans were so Republican. Their brains worked so differently than normal. Talking with a Republican was like talking to someone on drugs. They'd stare at you blankly as if they had no idea what you were talking about. Although Tom did like Corson's chief of staff, Elena. She was smart. Smarter than Tom was, he admitted. Her body was so-so, but her red hair made up for it. But Tom liked brains over body anyway, and admitting his intellectual inferiority made it so much easier to work with her, and do all the other stuff he'd gotten to do with her. It was good to be single in politics, for him anyway. Obviously, being married didn't stop some politicians from living it up, but he didn't think he'd be that way when he eventually settled down, even if he did end up running for office. Ultimately, they'd had to pull their bill last year. Too much public opposition, and too much Republican opposition despite Corson's help. It was hard living in a state with a Republican majority in the Senate. The House was just about evenly split, which gave Democrats more of a chance to do some real good. But this year would be different, Charlene had told him. This year they had help from Dr. Senator Donaldson. To live in her state, Tom daydreamed. To live in a purely Democratic state, with a Democratic majority in both state houses, with a Democratic governor to put his signature on everything that was right, Democratic, and to veto everything that was wrong. Senator Dr. Jane Donaldson, who got the mandatory vaccination law passed in her state, was touring the country to share her brilliance with fellow Democrats everywhere on how to get the same law passed in their own states. Donaldson had watched her fellow Democrat in California, Senator Dr. Richard Pan, get the job done in the Golden State, and she'd come up with an even better plan in her own state. So she was now sharing her expertise with the rest of the nation, and tonight was the welcome dinner to kick off their weekend of revitalizing their own bill and planning their next steps. 4 senators and their staff, plus 2 members of the House and their staff would be there, all people who had already signed on to the resurrection of the new bill. They didn't need any convincing, but they all needed training in this issue. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of work, but at least Elena will be there too. And so, my fellow Americans, we have a health crisis in our country, and it affects every state, the visiting senator concluded. You saw what happened in California when measles was allowed to take hold and spread among the pockets of unvaccinated children. This epidemic didn't just harm that state and endanger Dr. Pan's constituents, it spread nationwide and threatened us all. And other diseases are on the rise. Whooping cough, mumps, meningitis, and even polio is threatening to make a comeback. These diseases used to be eliminated and have now returned. We must put a stop to it as a nation. Our herd immunity is being threatened by too many anti-vaccine families whose fears are fueled by a few rogue anti-vaccine doctors who spread lies about vaccines. We all know that vaccines are safe and effective, and they are the right choice for every child. And it concerns me greatly when parents decline this life-saving treatment. It makes me wonder if they are even fit to be parents. Because vaccine laws are under the jurisdiction of each state, we can't rely on the federal government to make vaccines mandatory. We have to do it ourselves. They were victorious in California, and I won this battle in my own state as well. I would like to introduce you to the man who made it all possible. He is the head of my state's medical association, which represents the interests of over 10,000 physicians, and he, along with his team, are really the ones whom you should thank for this success and for saving the lives of so many children. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jackson Jones. Emilio Sanchez clapped politely along with the rest of the intimate group of 20 or so gathered in the private dining room of the steakhouse. He certainly loved these dinners, but this particular one had taken even his appetite away. He glanced sideways at Elena, his boss, and saw the genuine smile on her face as she watched the senator sit down and the well-dressed, middle-aged man stand up from the adjoining table and take the podium. She really believes this stuff, he thought. They all do. They actually believe it. Emilio looked past Elena at her boss and his, Senator James Corson. He does too, although he doesn't look quite so enraptured, more calculating, probably calculating votes, the votes that this endeavor will bring him versus the votes that he will lose over it, or calculating the funding his campaign will receive from the State Medical Association for his role in helping to pass this law. Not that they haven't paid him enough already. Emilio Sanchez had worked hard to get where he was. Despite graduating in the top 10% of his class at UVA Law, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was hired onto Senator Corson's staff as the token Mexican they'd been missing for a while. He knew he deserved it, though. He was good. But when this mandatory vaccine law came up last year, and Senator Corson decided to co-sponsor it, Emilio found himself torn. Legally and ethically, he had to represent his boss and support his endeavors, no matter how he personally felt. But he himself did not like vaccines. After what happened to his little brother, 10 years his junior, nobody would. So he found himself in a moral dilemma. He'd opted to follow the ethics that had been drilled into him in law school and do his job, and try to do it well enough to keep his conscience clear. But that's the thing about conscience. It cares a lot more about morals than it does ethics. Plus, there's my Hispanic Catholic mother in the forefront of my mind, making sure I follow my morals. And when I don't, she shows up in person. That had been an interesting evening, just the day after his boss had publicly announced his support of the bill for the first time last year. His mom showed up at the door to his little studio apartment overlooking the river, conveniently located within walking distance to the Capitol building and also, unfortunately, within driving distance of the house he grew up in. They'd talked and cried long into the night. She'd eventually left, accepting their compromise that he'd stay in this job for now. They'd both been thrilled when Senator Emerson had pulled the bill later due to lack of support, and they thought it was over. But now it's back. I shouldn't be surprised. In fact, this bill will probably hit every state eventually, and there won't be any legislator's office that will be safe. But working for a Republican should have been safe. Mandatory medical laws were much more of a Democratic agenda, and he'd been surprised when Republican Corson had thrown in his support. He'd bought the all medicine is good and vaccines are even better, so it's okay to force them argument. Emilio had done his best last year to subtly steer James's thinking in the right direction, but to no avail. He hadn't wanted to show all of his cards and get fired. And now he knew he had to be careful again, not just to keep his job, but to avoid breaking any actual laws that would either land him in jail, prevent him from ever sitting for the bar, or from ever working in politics again, because this year, Emilio would follow his Hispanic, Catholic, and mother-instilled conscience and do the right thing. Making that decision had been quite a relief. Even though it had added some stress to his life, the moral peace it brought his heart and mind more than made up for it. His morals also wouldn't allow him to break the letter of any laws, although he knew he'd be bending the spirit and intent of his legal obligation to represent his boss. But he thought he'd found a way to do it, and both James and Elena had loved the idea. Emilio was going to play devil's advocate in all their discussions, challenge every idea and point that anyone put together in support of the new version of the mandatory vaccination law, present the arguments that he knew the opposition would put forth so that Elena and the senator could plan the right counter-arguments. Emilio was worried that by doing this, he might be helping them instead, But he balanced that by realizing all of these counter-arguments would be heard by every legislator they talked to. He'd be able to plant the right seeds, make them think, challenge the pro-mandate way of thinking right there out in the open. And he promised himself and his mother that after this particular fight was over, whether they won or lost, he would find another job. He was thinking Texas. That was closer to his family's roots, and they valued medical freedom down there much more than some of the other states. He'd miss his mama and his brother, who needed full-time care at home and would so for the rest of his life. But they had a lot of family support here, family who helped take care of his little, well, not so little anymore, brother. Emilio suppressed the tear that always formed when he thought of his brother. His once happy, playful, smiling, talking, walking baby brother who had gone in for a checkup one day and had come home screaming and screaming and screaming and had never been the same again. The encephalopathy diagnosis hadn't been confirmed for about another year, but the sudden change that occurred the day after his one-year checkup had Emilio and his whole family convinced that something had triggered Arturo's change. It wasn't coincidence, like the doctors had told them. It didn't just happen for no reason. And Emilio knew that the only right thing to do was to help make sure that no family in America was ever forced to accept the risks of what had forever damaged his baby brother. Emilio sat up straighter as all of this flashed through his mind, sitting there at dinner. He'd missed whatever Mr. Jones had been saying, but from the laughter in the audience, it sounded like just some warm-up comments. He was now getting to the good stuff. So here are some of the main issues we are going to look at tonight, then break down further throughout the weekend. First, let's take a look at how the vote went down in California, then I'll share what happened in my own state. Out of the combined California Senate and Assembly, totaling 120 members, they needed 61 yes votes to pass it, and they got 70. Only 58 of the legislators voted for it, so this law just barely passed in California, and in my own state the numbers were very similar, which is interesting, and I asked myself why something so safe and good for our health would get so much opposition. More on that later. The votes were also very much along party lines. In the 80-member California Assembly, only 44 Democrats voted for it, and 8 voted against it or abstained. Virtually all Republicans voted against it, 25 of them, and only 2 voted for it. They got 24 yes votes in the 40-member Senate, again along party lines. And in my own state, it was about the same, but even a little closer. So here in your state, you have your work cut out for you. Senator Emerson will spend some time securing most of the Democrat votes, then focus more time meeting the Republicans. It was our experience that most Democrats who were already morally opposed to any mandatory medicine laws wouldn't be swayed. One of Senator Pan's Democratic colleagues had the nerve to call the law draconian in public, if you can believe that. So let's not waste much energy on the few Democrats who aren't on your side already. Senator Corson will start in with his Republican colleagues, and here is what I would suggest. Start with the senators who don't have children. In California, they found that these were much more likely to support the bill. Legislators who do have kids are much more in favor of parental rights to make medical decisions for their children, and are unwilling to put such decisions into the hands of the state. At the time of this vote, in the 120-member California legislature, 83 had children, and only half of those voted for this bill, whereas with the 37 who didn't have kids, 29 voted yes and 7 voted no. Legislators without kids were 4 times as likely to support this bill as those with kids. So it should be easy to get the non-parents onto our side with the simple, vaccines are safe and effective, they are for the good of society, they save lives, etc. messages. The simple arguments. Once they are convinced and we get some momentum, then it will be time to start working on the parents. Senator Corson, James, you have kids, and so does Mrs. Emerson. so you'll both really have to chat it up with the other parent legislators. You'll all have to be prepared for an influx of phone calls once this goes officially onto the agenda. Our friends from the People for Mandatory Vaccination have volunteered to help man your phone. This is a fairly small volunteer organization, so they may only have enough people for one helper per legislator. Our experience in my state showed that the number of calls to legislators' offices in opposition to the mandatory vaccination law was between 4 and 10 times greater than the calls in support. And the same was true in California. Basically, virtually all of the public opposed this bill, but the medical organizations, at least the mainstream ones, which also happen to be the ones with money, supported it, of course. So we'll team up a volunteer with each legislator who throws in his or her support for this bill, because that's where all the phone calls are going to start coming in. Here is why we think we saw such little support from the lay public. We think that most Americans are opposed to any laws that make any type of medical treatment mandatory, no matter how good the treatment is. They just don't want to give up their autonomy in making medical decisions for themselves and their children, especially their children. That's why it's our job to also focus on the good of society argument, that yes, medicine should be decided by individuals, but sometimes the good of society comes first. Herd immunity, which we also like to call community immunity because it's catchier, the danger of unvaccinated children, the rise of diseases, and the fact that the science is settled on vaccine safety. These are the 4 pillars of our argument. Now, you and I would agree that it's okay for a government to mandate something that is both necessary and harmless, and that's what vaccines are. So that's why it's okay for the government to step in where some parents have failed to make the right choice and vaccinate their children. But let me caution you not to go into that argument. Stay clear of it. Senator Pan introduced a Children's Bill of Rights in California last year, a bill that basically gave all children the right to have medical care and that the government would guarantee that right. But the opposition saw this as a stepping stone to making vaccines not only mandatory for school, but just plain mandatory, period. And not just vaccines, but any aspect of healthcare that their legislature, guided by the medical societies, decided was in the best interest of children. That's how they saw it anyway. Surprisingly, to all of us, almost all the support Dr. Pan had gotten for SB 277, which made vaccines mandatory for school, completely vanished. Very few would touch this new bill. Maybe he acted too soon. We'll see. He may try to figure out another way to go at it in the future. Senator Donaldson and I plan to as well, after we see how Pan's turns out. So be careful. Don't discuss with your legislator colleagues that we are trying to step in and interfere with parental medical decisions because that's unpopular. Just focus on the 4 pillars. And let me caution you, you don't want to dive too deeply into the medical side of these issues because they are complicated. Don't let yourself get drawn in when someone tries to argue medicine. You aren't doctors, so you won't win any medical discussions with any of your legislative colleagues or constituents who oppose this bill. Your whole job over the next few months will be to have conversations with your colleagues that focus on the 4 pillars. When they try to sidetrack you onto other issues like vaccine reactions, conflicts of interest in our vaccine safety research, parental rights, government overreach of police powers, and medical freedom, just go back to the 4 pillars. And what are they? Community immunity, the danger of unvaccinated children, diseases are on the rise, and vaccine safety science is settled. Emilio put himself at the back of the line so that he could be the last to greet Senator Dr. Donaldson. He wanted to ask her a few questions to get a measure on her intelligence and basic knowledge on vaccines and infectious diseases, and figured he'd get more time if there was no one behind him. He watched Elena leave the dining room with Tom from Emerson's office. Lucky bastard. If Tom shows up tomorrow morning for our first session with a big grin on his face, I'm going to punch him. Emilio had hoped he would have a chance to get to know Elena better, but now thought maybe it's a good idea that he didn't. with her being his supervisor and all. Plus, he didn't want her watching him too closely, and he wasn't really the casual sex type anyway. He just wished he could keep a serious girlfriend for more than a few months, but, "Hello, I'm Jane." Emilio stared at the hand that was being offered to him, and he froze for a second. I really have to shake this person's hand? He did so, and hoped his true feelings didn't show on his face. "Hello, Senator. Thank you so much for coming to help us. Emilio Sanchez with Senator Corson's office." Emilio saw the lobbyist, Jackson Jones, standing a few steps away working on his phone. "Can I ask a couple of tough medical questions I've gotten lately that I'm not sure how to answer? I know we'll probably learn all this tomorrow, but I wanted to pick your medical brain on this. First, I thought all vaccines prevented the spread of diseases, but I'm hearing that some do and some don't. Can you tell me which is which?" The doctor stared at Emilio for what turned into an increasingly uncomfortable 10 seconds before she answered. "That's a good question. Let me see. Well, of course, the measles vaccine does, and whooping cough. Diphtheria vaccine too. We definitely don't want diphtheria to come back. Polio vaccine, of course. Chickenpox too. Let me think. The list of vaccines that don't prevent the transmission of its disease is very small. I think only the tetanus vaccine doesn't prevent someone from passing tetanus on to another person. But wait, I think that's because tetanus isn't even contagious anyway." "So why the hell did you include tetanus vaccine in your list of vaccines that school children needed in order to help keep other kids around them safe? And polio, whooping cough, and diphtheria vaccines don't prevent spread either," Emilio did not say out loud. "That makes sense. Thanks. Next is hepatitis B. I get a lot of questions about how we can justify making this vaccine mandatory for daycare and school when it's a sexually transmitted disease and doesn't seem like a risk to babies and children. I get that a lot too, but I like to look at all vaccines as equally important. They're all so critical and life-saving, so they simply all should be mandated for school and daycare. I think Jackson is right on this. Steer away from arguing medical logic with people. Just keep it simple." "I like that, Senator. Thanks. Last one, if I can ask. Which diseases are on the rise? When I try to find data on that, I can't find a continuous increase in anything. Just some occasional ups and downs of whooping cough, but that's it. Can you help me out?" Emilio wasn't sure why, but he suddenly felt someone's eyes on him. He glanced a little to his right, past Emerson, and saw Mr. Jones looking at him with intense interest, but with a very blank expression, as if Emilio didn't matter, but also seemed to matter greatly at the same time. I thought I was keeping my voice down, but this guy apparently has excellent hearing. "Well, Emilio, obviously whooping cough, but also measles and polio are on the rise too. But yes, you'll pick up more on that tomorrow." Yep, that's what I thought. This woman has no idea what she's talking about. And this is the person who is leading the nation into mandatory vaccination? Hey, maybe this is a blessing. Someone who is clearly so clueless about vaccines and disease trends couldn't possibly sell this idea to an entire nation. Could she? But Emilio had the sickening feeling that yes, she probably could. With smart people like Jones to do all the real thinking, and the amount of pharma money this woman had behind her, she could. "So how long have you been a politician, Dr. Donaldson?" Emilio was genuinely curious. No pause this time. "Oh, silly, I'm not a pediatrician. I'm a real doctor. I'm a surgeon." That explains why you don't know jack about vaccines, Emilio would have given his left hand to say out loud. Jackson Jones dialed one of the numbers listed under his favorites tab as he stepped away. "Bob, it's me. I have a name I want you to look into. I want to know if he or any of his family show up in our system. Yes, a few days is fine." Elena Moretti shook the business owner's hand, allowing her hand to linger in his slightly longer than necessary, and thanked him for his support and for informing her about the new business park that the city planners were proposing in his city, a business park that would cut deeply into his own business. And his wasn't a small business, over 2,000 employees, and he'd also been very supportive of James's campaigns over the years. Elena assured him she would let the senator know right away and work with him to see what they could do. She looked at the next appointment on her schedule, then rolled her eyes. Not another one. How many of these crazies do I have to sit with before this vaccine bill is done? But she didn't really have a choice. Every constituent had the right to be heard, and hear them she would. I just don't have to listen to them, especially because they aren't donors. She stood up and walked out to the small reception area and approached the group of 3 women and 1 man, sizing them up as she went. They were well-dressed, young to middle-aged adults, each with a small stack of handouts on their laps. They stood as she approached, and polite introductions went around. Elena gestured for them to follow her down the hallway to the conference room. She poked her head into Emilio's office along the way and told him to sit in on this with her. The group took chairs at a long table in a somewhat cramped conference room, Emilio trailing in after them. Hi, I'm Emilio Sanchez, one of Miss Moretti's assistants on this particular bill, and you 4 are... I am Barbara Highfisher, one of Senator Corson's constituents. I have brought with me today 3 of my friends. Sophia from the Immunity Information Center, Kimberly from Vaccine Voices, and Dr. Montgomery Ward, a pediatrician. We want to chat with you about the new mandatory vaccine bill. Elena sat politely through their spiel. What was interesting with this group is that they didn't focus on the dangers of vaccination, how vaccines cause autism, how the diseases aren't deadly, or about how their own children had been harmed by vaccines, all the stuff she'd had to sit through over the last couple weeks with every other group. Instead, these 3, she didn't include the constituent at first, because it was obvious she was just there to get these other 3 non-constituents a meeting, seemed intelligent, well-informed, and well-spoken. And some of their points were refutations of the 4 pillars that Jackson Jones had trained them on during their weekend seminars. So she was prepared with the packaged responses. But then they went beyond that and said a number of things that Elena hadn't heard before. She usually didn't take any notes at these meetings. She knew Emilio knew these topics, and he'd be able to walk her and James through them later. But she did jot down a few new things these people brought up that Jackson Jones had left out. First, the California measles outbreak hadn't touched any schools. Not a single case was even transmitted in a school. It was all in restaurants, stores, medical centers, and homes. That surprised her. And their point that having a mandatory vaccine law for schools wouldn't have changed the course of that measles outbreak was valid. The doctor made a point that if they really wanted to prevent measles everywhere, what they really should do is not let any unvaccinated children in public anywhere. Make everyone show their immunization papers everywhere they went. That would keep measles away. But Elena knew that they also knew how ludicrous that sounded and would be political suicide for any legislator who tried it. Other than a driver's license, free Americans don't need papers to show anyone. Then he made a point of saying that most vaccines don't prevent the spread of the disease they are intended to prevent, which couldn't possibly be right. The doctor obviously sensed her doubt, and he offered a very convincing example of how the tetanus vaccine only makes your body generate antibodies against the tetanus toxin, so that if the germ ever invades your body, the toxin gets neutralized, so it doesn't paralyze you, but the tetanus germs are still there. That made sense, but that was only one vaccine. The doctor, rightly so, said that he didn't want to spend the entire time with a lecture on immunity, and he gave her a handout that summarized which vaccines don't prevent person-to-person spread of its disease, adding that this list included diphtheria, whooping cough, flu, and polio vaccines. He emphasized the point that mandating a vaccine that doesn't even prevent the spread of the disease is unnecessary because it won't reduce infections in school at all. Then the one woman's point about how pockets of unvaccinated children don't correlate with disease outbreaks was also surprising. She gave Elena some data to back up her statements, which she'd probably just throw away. Apparently, LA County had one of the lowest vaccine exemption rates. Only 1.6% of school kids had registered a personal belief exemption, PBE, from vaccines, meaning they'd opted out of vaccines. Yet they had 29 cases of measles. Marin County, with a much higher PBE rate of 6.5%, only had 2 cases. Looking at whooping cough in California, counties with some of the highest numbers of whooping cough had the lowest numbers of PBEs, between 1.6 and 1.9%. Her point being that schools with a higher proportion of unvaccinated kids don't have more disease. Then she went on about how a senator, during his campaign to pass the California vaccine law, had claimed that some schools had PBE rates as high as 25%, and that such schools with that many unvaccinated kids are outbreaks just waiting to happen. But many of the schools with high PBE rates are very small schools. So a small school of 100 kids with a 25% PBE rate would only mean 25 unvaccinated kids. A large public school with 2,000 kids with only a 5% PBE rate would mean 100 unvaccinated kids. So there would often be more unvaccinated kids at schools with the highest vaccination rates. But again, there was no scientific correlation between disease trends and PBE rates. And finally, would she just shut up already? Someone with a PBE could possibly only have opted out of just one vaccine, like hepatitis B. Many would be fully immunized against all the real contagious diseases. So claiming that the high rates of PBEs puts everyone in danger just isn't accurate. Geez, I'd love to have this girl on my team. She could talk circles around anyone. It's a good thing for us that no one really cares about that much detail on this issue. The third person, the other woman, then went on and on about all the conflicts of interest in vaccine safety research, and Elena knew this lady must be making most of this up. There's no way that the former head of the CDC, who was in charge of all vaccine safety research for almost a decade, would have been allowed to own stock in one of our nation's largest vaccine manufacturers. No one would have allowed that, especially not over $4 million worth, according to some financial newspaper in the Dakotas, as this lady claimed. And there's no way that vaccine company would openly hire that head of the CDC to lead their vaccine division. Sure, she could see the CDC head owning some general stock in pharmaceuticals, like the most recent head did before she resigned after just 9 months. Many people who devote their lives to public service in the government hope to land a cushy job someday, but $4 million worth seems too outrageous. Then she claimed that another doctor who headed the CDC's vaccine approval board in the 90s also held stock in a vaccine company, and that some of the doctors who served on those approval boards had financial ties to vaccine makers. Then there was this new secret group at the CDC that called themselves SPIDER. What did that stand for? She had to write it down. Scientists Preserving Integrity, Diligence, and Ethics in Research. This group had lodged a formal complaint that their own CDC is compromised by corporate and government interests and has lost its mission to objectively safeguard the health of our community. But she didn't stop there. The CDC whistleblower, Dr. Johnson, was it, who was part of the largest CDC study that proved vaccines did not cause autism, was now saying the research was faked. What is she smoking? Helena wondered. I'd like some of that. Finally, it was the doctor again who brought it all home with another claim, one she knew for sure just couldn't be true. The claim that the recommended CDC schedule had not been adequately tested for safety. He said something about an Institute of Medicine. She'd have to look up who that was, claiming back in 2013 that, and he quoted, which she tried to write down quickly, Studies designed to examine the long-term effects of the cumulative number of vaccines have not been conducted. Existing research has not been designed to test the entire immunization schedule, and the committee generally found a paucity of information that addressed the risk of adverse events in association with the complete recommended immunization schedule. She'd have a long debrief with Emilio about all this, then let James know, just so he wasn't ever caught off guard when he talked to someone smart. She'd pass this along to Tom as well. She knew most of this couldn't be true, but they all needed to be prepared to counter any of it that is true, especially if any of this came out in the hearings. We spent a whole weekend with the senator doctor who was supposed to know it all, and her lobbyist who seemed to be the real brains behind the success in their state, and all they focused on were their 4 bloody pillars and how to promote them. They didn't get into any details on the medical arguments or any of these ideas I'm hearing now. What a colossal waste of time that weekend had been. Well, except for the nights. Tom was never a waste of time. And then the constituent, Barbara something, whom she didn't think would have anything important to say, ended up saying one of the most interesting things of all. Who has the moral authority to deny anyone the right to follow their conscience or religious beliefs when making a decision about a pharmaceutical product that could brain injure or end their lives or their children's lives? Finally, the vaccines are dangerous argument. Utilitarian health policies that force everyone to be treated the same are cruel and immoral. Without flexible medical and religious exemptions to vaccination, enforcement of a one-size-fits-all vaccine law creates fear and distrust of government and doctors. Wait, she's not really saying vaccines are too dangerous. She's saying that because they can be dangerous to some, a government does not have the right to mandate them. We don't have the right to force all of them on everyone. There has to be some flexibility. Elena realized that the last woman had come to the end of her point, so she took the opportunity to bring an end to the meeting. She thanked them for coming and assured them she'd let the senator know about their concerns. Why did they even bother to come in and try to argue against a bill that our office sponsored? It's not like we can change our minds now. They should be focusing on all the other members of the House and the Senate. They are the ones they need to convince. I better give Tom a heads up so he can help me spread the word to the other chiefs of staff and their schedulers. We can't let people like these 3 get in front of too many legislators. We'll dig up some dirt on this doctor, too, and spread it around so our colleagues have the right preconceptions about him. I feel like that was a waste of time, said Kimberly, as the 3 women waited for the elevator. Their office co-sponsored the bill. It's not like we were going to change their minds. I agree that we weren't going to change their minds, Sophia countered, but I think it's also important that we be able to tell other legislators that we met with Corson's office and shared our concerns with them. Well, that makes sense, Kimberly agreed. But I've been told by a few friends who are big donors to some of the senators that when it comes to trying to educate a legislator about an issue, it's money that talks, not logic or data. If you aren't a donor, they don't listen. They vote yes or no based on who they owe favors to, or who owes them a favor, like, you vote for my bill and I'll vote for yours. It's all about money and influence, not about what's right and wrong. Do you really think that's true? Asked Sophia. They can't all be that way. No, they aren't all that way in my experience, chimed in Barbara, the constituent. Some do have ethics, and for some, being their constituent has more weight than being a donor. The important thing is to know who is who. And that's where relationship building comes in, Sophia continued. I've been told by a number of experienced friends that the most important way to have an ethical legislator's ear is for them to know who you are because they see you around their office and at their events. Be friendly and respectful and let them know you are a voice for medical freedom and parental rights. You aren't there just for one issue. You are there to be a source of valued information. Then, when a vaccine-related issue comes up, You have an in to share your 2 cents as their constituent. You aren't just some crazy lady who shows up once talking nonsense. You are that intelligent, friendly, well-spoken supporter who's often around. And you are a voter, maybe a financial supporter too, but not in a way that looks like you are trying to buy your way in. The more legislators we can build relationships with, the more impact we will have over the years as vaccine issues come up. But that takes time, added Barbara, time that many moms don't have. So those of us who do have the time and are good at it spend our time focusing on relationships. And don't forget about lobbyists. I know some people view them as evil, but when you hire a lobbyist with a good reputation whom the legislators already know and trust, that's another way to get their ear. Too bad that takes money that many of us don't have. Sophia again. But you are right. If we were more organized and pooled our resources to do this right, we'd be more effective. And don't forget, finished Barbara, when you are dealing with medical legislation, you have to get a doctor in the room if you want to be taken seriously. Where is Dr. Monty, by the way? A couple of moms grabbed him for a picture, I think. Now they're chatting, explained Kimberly. Sophia rolled her eyes. I think he secretly enjoys the celebrity attention, even though he'll swear to you he doesn't. But it really helps to bring a doctor along for something like this. Well, he knows we have another meeting in 5 minutes, right? Dr. Ward jogged up. Sorry, I was just, we know, taking a picture, Sophia said. Oh, Dr. Monty, smiled Kimberly, winking at the 2 other women and moving over next to him. Can I take my picture with you? The girls in my group back home won't believe I actually got to meet you. The doctor blushed. I think you're right, Sophia, observed Barbara. He does like being a celebrity. The doctor blushed even more. You're the celebrity, Barbara. Why didn't you introduce yourself to that staffer as being the head of NCIV? I think, in this case, I'd get more credibility just being Corson's constituent, since I live in his district. Oh, and can I get a picture too? Stop teasing him, you two. Sophia decided the joke was over. Okay, so you don't like it, Monty. But that's what you get for doing the right thing, for standing up for others who need your help. They love you for it. I wish my husband and I had met you before what happened to my Arabella. I feel like I'm not doing enough, admitted the doctor, changing the subject, and I'm not sure we are going about this the right way. We were just lamenting the fact that we haven't built the proper relationships with any of these elected officials, agreed Sophia, so they don't really have any reason to listen to us because they don't know us. And we are here only for today, continued the doctor. What I should have done is taken a whole week off and tried to get into as many of these offices as I could, so they could get to know me, see that I'm an intelligent, humble, informed doctor who knows a heck of a lot about vaccines and is there to answer their questions, not just preach at them. I feel as if it matters less what I say and more how I say it and what impression I leave them with. Barbara jumped back in. Plus, we should have been doing this months ago, influencing these guys before the hearing and the vote. People think that bills are decided in the actual hearings. They're not. They are decided long before that, as legislators and their staffers meet, discuss, and negotiate. That's the time to shut these bills down. Once they make it to a hearing, the game is mostly over. The deals are done. We try to present an educated defense in the hearing, as if that's suddenly going to change all the legislators' minds. It doesn't. More of us have to build bridges with each legislator in our home districts, so when we need to bring in an expert, they are ready to listen. And all this has to happen at the first hint of a vaccine bill, not after it's already on the legislative agenda. So we are playing catch-up, trying to let them know the medical facts and why this law is wrong. I have so much to say to these legislators, but there just isn't enough time and opportunity to say it all. And I don't even know if they're listening because they don't know me from Adam. I'm just some doctor they don't know. I wish we could make them all read a simple 5-page summary that has every important piece of information in it. They think they're getting that in the legislative summary that's supposedly written for them as an objective presentation of both sides, but we all know that's bogus. And no legislator is going to read even 2 pages late in the game, let alone 5, agreed Sophia. That's why we make all these one-page flyers and graphics with simplified points on them as a last-ditch effort. But I have a sinking feeling that this whole fight isn't about convincing any of these guys with facts and logic. From what Barbara is saying, and what I've heard from others, it may be more about the relationships you build for some, and how much money you've donated for others, and we haven't done enough of either. If we lose this vote, then we may have to turn our attention to the public, to the voters, convince them that mandatory vaccination laws are wrong, just as all laws that mandate medicine or penalize the non-compliant are wrong. Well, we have to keep talking to them for now anyway, finished Barbara. Who knows? We may get lucky and reach some. Yeah, pretty much everything they said was true, Emilio told Elena when she cornered him later that day. I had to look up some of what they said because some of it was even new to me, but yes, it's all true. Even that bullcrap about the $4 million of pharma stock and the head of the CDC? It was reported in a news story, apparently. I have it pulled up right here online. Emilio showed her. I couldn't find the original source yet, just this article from Health Impact News, some granola news site. They claim she sold $2.3 million worth of her stock in Merck once she left the CDC, but held on to the other half. But their link to the original source isn't live anymore, so I can't verify it. But if this is true, then the head of the CDC was basically overseeing almost 10 years worth of CDC safety research on the vaccines made by the very company she held this stock in. Some might look at that as a conflict of interest, others as just business as usual. Well, don't mention these issues in our mock hearing presentation tomorrow morning. With all these possible arguments against this bill, we need to make double sure James and Charlene are well prepared for any questions if they come up. But I don't want these issues to get out if we can help it. It would have been nice if Jackson Jones or Dr. Donaldson had given us a heads up on some of this. They must have had to fend off all of these same questions. Jackson Jones answered his phone and listened to the report from his contact. I had a feeling something was up with this kid. Brother is a vaccine injury compensation program recipient, huh? When? Back in 1995? Severe encephalopathy? 3.2 mil, huh? That's just great. Yeah, well, this victim's brother is actually working in Corson's office. Yeah, Corson in the state where I was a few days ago. Yes, that Corson to whom you've been so generous. I have no idea how he got hired there. Not everyone has access to your list. Yes, sir. I'll make sure to let them know. Jackson glanced at his watch. Midnight here on the West Coast. That's 3 a.m. back east. I'll send an email now, then call James' chief of staff in the morning. Half a day can't hurt. Resources for all facts, data, and arguments mentioned in this chapter are available at johnphilipryan.com.